All right, I think we'll get ready to start. With us today, we have Lauren. She is going to be talking about character arcs. If you're interested in writing compelling characters that grow across a book or series, she'll be talking about providing an overview of K.M. Weiland's approach to designing fleshed out characters with positive arcs. Using the mnemonic Glowtown, if I pronounced that correctly, coined by our own WriteHive members Ysabelle and Maria, everyone should be able to write a succinct and yet comprehensive outline of their characters' arcs that will come to shape the overarching story itself. So, I'm going to give Lauren the mic, and if you have any questions, definitely dump them in the character arcs text chat, and we'll be going through them as we go. And here's Lauren.
So as Coda said, this is going to kind of be an overview of K.M. Weiland's approach to doing character arcs in the same way that you would kind of plot out plot arcs itself. So I am personally a pantser, but this approach is something that I still use even though I pants a bunch of my stories, because I'm a big believer of having the character and the character arcs planned out in advance before writing the story itself, even though I am a pantser, because I pants plot points, but I still know basically where the characters start and where the characters end up. And they do this through 5 different components that K.M. Weiland outlines on her blog. And at the very end of this, I'm also going to link to Weiland's blog as well, so you guys can check that out, because she has all of this information completely free online, available for anybody to use, even though she also published a whole bunch of books about this. So it's really awesome of her to make this freely available to any aspiring authors out there. And so these 5 components can be summed up in a mnemonic that was coined by our own members, Ysabelle and Maria. And this mnemonic is Glowtown. And the ones in parentheses are not actually part of it. It's just a way to remember it. So the components of Glowtown are ghost, lie, truth, want, and need. So this is pretty much the, you can think of this as a very simple character outline or character sheet for you to fill out for each of your main characters that are going to experience some sort of positive character growth across the series itself. So let me get into this and explain what each of these are just a little bit. So first of all, ghost. This is the background that effectively leads to why there needs to be character growth in the first place. It's kind of the root of the problem, and it's what haunts your character. What is it that's causing them to be in this position at the beginning of the story that's going to result in them needing to grow over the course of the story itself? And so, as I said here, the ghost informs the lie, and the lie is what does your character believe at the beginning of the story that is preventing them from their internal growth. So this is something they falsely think or falsely believe in that is going to be exposed as untruth over the course of the story itself, and they're going to need to, at some point, embrace the truth. And so the truth is, what do they need to learn? And it's usually the opposite of the lie that's going to lead them to completing their positive character arc. And just one sidebar here real quick. This is going to be about positive character arcs. There are, of course, negative character arcs and flat character arcs as well, but positive character arcs make up the vast majority of character arcs in most fiction. So that's just what we're going to be focusing on here today. However, Weiland also does have outlines for flat character arcs and negative character arcs as well. So if you guys want to check that out, it's definitely worth looking into if you think you've got characters that might fall into that category. So now I've gone over the ghost, the truth, and the lie. And the last 2 components of this are the want and the need. So the want is, what do they want at the beginning of the story more than anything else, which is probably what's going to drive them to actually participate and be active in the story itself, but is also usually misled. So this is going to be informed by their lie. It's the thing they want at the beginning of the story that they think is going to bring them happiness or closure or whatever it is that they want most in the world. But as we readers know, that is usually not the case, and there's actually something else that they truly need in order to complete their growth. And so the need is, what do they actually need, as opposed to what do they want to complete their character arc. And just as the want is informed by the lie, the need is informed by their truth that they need to discover. So that's kind of it. Those are the basic building blocks you need. If you can just write down these 5 elements of your character, you're going to have, just similar to a plot arc, you're going to have a character arc that's going to start at your lie and your want at the beginning of the book and end at the need and the truth at the end of the book. And just like I said, it reflects the same structure of plot arcs itself. So let me just recap that a little bit in text in case you guys need that. So at the beginning of the book, we have the want, and that's usually made apparent, if not the first page, the first few pages. This is something that is core to their character and just driving them. And we might not know exactly what the lie is that they're believing yet, but the seeds are usually there. We usually are getting hinted at what is driving this want. And then, of course, at the end of the book, we know that the character needs to discover their truth and their need in order to complete whatever it is that they are trying to do and to complete their character arc. And that only leaves the ghost. And so just as the truth and the need pop up at the end of the book, or are completed at the end of the book, and the lie and the want is at the beginning of the book, usually we get hints at the ghost somewhere in the middle of the story. So this is usually somewhere in Act 2, we start to explore the reasons behind their belief in their lie. And but I should add one caveat. The ghost is not always explored or not always given reasons. Sometimes a character just has a lie that isn't necessarily informed by a ghost on the page, and that can be okay. So if you don't think you have a ghost, if your character is just kind of a really mean person and they've just been that way and there's not a reason for it, that can work as long as you show them having change. However, it's usually more believable and creates a more fleshed out 3-dimensional character to have this ghost that is informing and driving their lie. So let's go into just a couple examples of this now that I've kind of defined what each of these are. So a couple different examples in fiction I have are Toy Story with Woody and Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender. So do you guys care which one we use as an example first? Or do you want to try to guess at what some of these are? All right, I'm going to tell you Woody, and then we'll see if you guys can guess what Zuko's story is. So first of all, I'm going to just start from what is the easiest to pick out first. So for those that are familiar with Toy Story, it's about toys that are sentient, but they pretend to not be sentient, and they go on adventures. And I'm sure probably most of you are all familiar with Toy Story. So the main character, one of the main characters in the first Toy Story, is Woody, who is Andy's favorite toy. And his want, as you guys might already have figured out, his want is to be, of course, the favorite toy. And that's shown right off the bat at the very first scene that Woody is taking any action in. He's calling the shots. He's telling everybody what to do. He's the one who's in charge, and he really cares about Andy. So, of course, when the conflict appears with Buzz appearing, then there's this conflict of who's now the favorite toy. And that leads to the problems across the rest of the book due to jealousy. So we know that his want is to be the favorite toy. And his lie, which is what is informing this want, is that his self-worth is determined by his popularity. He needs to be loved, he needs to be wanted, and he needs this more than anything else in the world, and so that's why he wants to be the favorite toy. And again, we don't, it's not necessarily laid out immediately that he thinks his self-worth is determined by how much he is loved by Andy and the other toys, but you do see hints of that right from the very beginning, and you see more hints of this lie when Buzz pops up, because then you see the jealousy start to come out. So now we have his want and we have his lie. This is where he starts at the beginning of the story. And then where does he end up at the end of the story? At the end of the story, we come to find that he's able to accept Buzz and he's able to share the spotlight. So we know that his need, what he actually needed, even though he wanted to be the popular or the favorite toy, he needs to be able to share the spotlight. And that's kind of just implicit throughout the rest of the story. He's able to accept that he can share the spotlight with Buzz, and that doesn't mean that he is any less. And so, of course, the truth is that multiple people can be loved by Andy, and that's okay, and that doesn't mean that he is any less for it. So we have his want, lie, need, truth. The thing we haven't covered here is his ghost. And what's interesting with Toy Story is that it's not actually explored in the first Toy Story. What is informing his lie that his self-worth is determined by his popularity, that's just kind of a given in the first one. However, what's interesting is the second Toy Story is entirely about the ghost. The entire plot of the movie is about the ghost. And the ghost is knowing what happens to toys that are forgotten or lost. And so knowing that toys that are forgotten are just kind of discarded, they're not considered valuable at all, and they're just completely forgotten or sold or given away is pretty much the worst thing that could happen to a toy. And so it's interesting that this is not actually addressed in the first movie, but again, it wasn't actually needed in the first movie. So this is an example of a case where you don't have to have a ghost in the story itself, or you can explore the ghost in maybe book 2 or sequels or anything like that. So that's kind of interesting to note that Pixar, which is so known for its amazing characters, actually doesn't need to have the ghost in the story itself. With that, let's talk about Zuko and Avatar and see if you guys can guess what each component of their character arc is. So let's start with the want, because that one is pretty much the most obvious and the easiest to start from and work back from. So what does Zuko want more than anything in the world for those who have seen Avatar? To regain his honor and his father's approval. Yes, that's actually also part of his lie as well. And usually the want and the lie are very closely tied together. So the way that I'm putting it, which is also the same as what you said, Wagerman, the want is to kill or capture the Avatar. Exactly. The more than anything in the world, they want to capture the Avatar, and the why is the lie. And so that's what Wagerman just said. Why do they want to capture the Avatar? Because he believes that if he captures the Avatar, it's going to restore his honor and it's going to get his father's approval. So these two are closely tied. He wants the Avatar. It's kind of what's driving him at the beginning of the story and what's causing plot to happen, because if he didn't want to capture the Avatar, there would be a much shorter season 1. And he has to do it because he believes that he must restore his honor to get his father's approval. Yes, so I agree with you. Yeah, he must that capturing the Avatar will restore his honor, and that will also be his father's approval. It's kind of all three of those bundled into one. There's a couple different approaches you can take with that. So if we know that his want is to capture the Avatar and his lie is that he thinks this is going to restore his honor and gain his father's approval, what then does he actually need in the end? Yeah, we have he needs his own approval. He needs to realize his father is a piece of shit. He needs to be true to his nation and himself. And yes, I agree with all of those. So I kind of summed this up with a more physical, to listen to Uncle Iroh for once. He also needs to do that too. So I think all those can kind of be summed up in he needs to help overthrow his father's reign. He needs to help. Before he was looking for his father's approval, now he needs to overthrow his reign. And for all those reasons that you guys just listed, that was the truth. The truth is that his father is terrible. The truth is that he needs to be true to himself and his nation. The truth is he probably should be listening to Uncle Iroh the whole time. So you guys kind of also nailed that. The truth is the emotional drive behind this need. He was never really dishonored. He doesn't need his dad. And really the only person that can give him honor or take honor away is himself. So I just put my notes in there, but again, pretty much everything what you guys said are all parts of his truth. Yeah. And then, of course, the ghost, which we really don't need at the end because this is something we learned back in season 1. But what was the ghost that was informing his lie and his want? Yep, absolutely. So we have Ogreman saying, being burned by his dad during the Agni Kai and banished, so fear of loss of family and meaning. Yeah, that was a big part of his ghost. But if you even dig under that, just being banished itself um, was part of the ghost, but even deeper than that, the reason that he feels like he has to restore his honor is because he feels like he did something wrong, that he feels like, you know, he was truly being punished during the Agni Kai, because he really is looking for his father's love and approval, and he thinks that he can gain back his family's approval of him if he's able to restore his honor. And so ultimately, in the end, of course, we know that he doesn't need his father's love and approval. And in fact, he needs to realize that parts of his family are absolutely terrible, and that he doesn't need them to be in his life. And he needs to basically determine what it means to have honor for himself. So does that all kind of make sense to you guys? I think Zuko is a fantastic example of a character arc. I think, as most people are aware who have seen the show. But you can break down most characters throughout most movies and TV shows and books in a similar manner. There's also a really good example of Thor on Weiland's site as well, and going through what his ghosts and lie and truth and want and need are. So this is something that doesn't just apply to books, of course, but TV shows and movies. And anytime you really resonate with a character, I find that they hit a lot of these boxes with the character arcs. Yeah, the want can be a little more subtle too, definitely. The want usually is what you see right off the bat and kind of drives the story forward, because it's what causes your character to take action. But it can be more subtle depending on what kinds of stories that we are facing. For romance stories, it's going to be a very different kind of want than a fantasy action adventure. A lot of times in fantasy, for instance, wants end up being MacGuffins, so physical objects. They're trying to, you know, throw the ring into Mordor, or they're trying to capture the Avatar, or they're trying to do find or obtain or destroy physical things. But in a lot of other pieces of fiction, where the want is more emotional rather than physical, it can be a lot more subtle and a little bit harder to pin down. And I think I can use Thor as a good example of that, actually. So for the movie Thor, his ghost is that he wants to be king, and that he is the next in line king. And so he kind of has this pressure at the back of him the entire time. I need to be king. You know, what does it mean to be a king? And that's what's informing everything that he does, is preparing to be a king. His lie is that might makes right. He believes that if he is able to be powerful, then that's what will make a good king. And of course, the truth in the end is that might does not make right, and that to be a good king, you actually have to be a good leader and good with people. And so his want is to prove himself worthy of being king. So it's less of a physical thing, although I guess he does kind of want his hammer as well. But the hammer is more of a metaphor than something he's actually trying to physically achieve throughout the movie. He's trying to, in a similar way to Zuko, restore his honor and prove that he's worthy of being a king. So that can be a little bit harder to identify right off the bat. Yep, you're writing a rom-com and my MC just wants approval. Yeah, so that can also be kind of hard, but it can also be something that you can easily hint at in the first act itself. You know, if their want is approval, then this is going to inform a lot of the actions that they take. So a lot of the things that they're going to be saying and doing is in an attempt to get approval from others. So that can be something that you can hint at both through conversations and character interactions. And of course, emotionally, how does this affect them by constantly seeking approval from others emotionally? Yeah, I think he needs to be worthy of being king, and he just wants to be it. So he needs to earn it, basically. And so one thing that you see come up a lot in fiction is that often characters need to they are able to fully embrace their need by sacrificing their want. So it's usually when they give up the idea, in Thor's case, giving up the idea that he will be king, that he finally actually becomes worthy of obtaining it. So when he embraces the need to be worthy, then he is actually achieving what he wanted all along, although by that point they usually don't actually want it anymore, or they don't want it as strongly as they previously did because now they've earned it. Other times, you see that characters have to choose to let go of their want in order to obtain their need. So they either have to make some sort of sacrifice, and that's what allows them to have their need in the end. So you'll often see this dichotomy between the want and the need. That usually is one is sacrificed for the other, or one embracing their need makes them worthy of their want. So does anyone have overall questions on this character arc here for just these 5 points: the ghost, lie, truth, need, and want? Because you can get into more detail, and there is more detail on K.M. Weiland's blog as well. But pretty much if you can hit those 5 points, then you have outlined over the course of the book where your character is starting, where they're ending, and then in the middle of the book, kind of exploring how they're getting from their start to the end, and why they wanted things in the first place by exploring their ghost. Is the ghost always necessary? Nope, not always. It's usually, it can be good to help flesh out characters and make them feel more realistic by kind of informing why their lie was there in the first place. But just like the example I had with Toy Story, the ghost wasn't actually present in that story itself, and it totally worked, and the characters were very believable and relatable. So I don't have Kim Weidland's book on characters, but I have it pre-ordered or ordered, so it should be coming here in the next week or two. But I have several friends who have read through it, and they can't recommend it enough. And a lot of the content from the book is on her blog for free, so you can definitely check that out at any point and kind of reiterate the points that I've just covered in a lot more detail. And it's extremely useful. A subtle, important difference between want and need seem to really drive up the stakes and tension for stories. Are there instances where those can be completely distinct or not related to cause tension? So you're asking if the want and the need itself can be completely distinct? Yes. Yeah, actually, in the book that I just wrote recently, I had completely different wants and needs. And the want was a physical object, and the need was an emotional growth. And almost always the need is emotional growth, and the want can either be physical or emotional. It can really go either way. But usually that physical thing that they want, for instance, Zuko trying to capture the Avatar, is informed by an emotional want itself, which is their lie. So, for instance, I have a story where a girl wants to play the jazz clarinet because her grandfather played the jazz clarinet and he died, and she inherited his clarinet. And so, over the course of the story, the clarinet was stolen, and so she's trying to get the clarinet back. So her want is a physical MacGuffin. She wants the clarinet. It's very straightforward. However, her emotional growth over the course of the story is actually dealing with the death of her grandpa, and she's kind of basically placed her grandpa in the clarinet itself. She sees that if she loses the clarinet, she loses her grandpa, even though he's already passed. So she needs to learn over the course of the story that the way to embrace her grandfather and the ways to move on is not to have the physical clarinet itself, but to honor his memory. And honoring his memory was an emotional growth for her. So physically, the entire book, she wants the clarinet. That's what she wants more than anything. She has to get the clarinet back. However, the emotional growth is her learning how to honor her grandfather. And so in this case, that's her learning how to improvise, which is a basic part of jazz that causes her to fail her tryout at the beginning of the book because she doesn't know how to improvise. So the book itself is learning her learning to go from being a very rigid person to being a more flexible person, learning how to improvise and learning how to be just more flexible in parts of life, even though her physical want was something very tangible. her need is something that's very emotional and very not tangible. So you absolutely can have things that seem completely unrelated, but at the end of the day, they're both kind of tied together by the ghost somehow. I had someone say, the story about the clarinet reminds me of John Wick. Kind of like that, except for middle grade, and there's fantasy. And no shooting. So yeah, good question, Love Song. Was the ghost existing in Toy Story 1, but just not stated because we all know the life cycle of toys? That's a really good question. So this wasn't something that was explored on scene in Toy Story 1. There was no real discussion about what happens to lost or forgotten toys on screen in Toy Story 1, even though that entire discussion was the whole plot of Toy Story 2. But you're right. Maybe we could infer this just from our own knowledge and personal experience of what happens to toys that are forgotten and lost. So maybe it was more implied or just assumed that the viewer themselves would understand what's going on due to our own personal experience. However, I also think that if for some reason you never had toys and you never had that experience, the movie and the plot still stands on its own without that background. And I believe that Woody still is a fleshed out, believable character without knowing what informs his lie, because wanting to be loved and wanting to be wanted is something that's very innate to, I think, most people. So that's what I have for you guys based on K.M. Weiland's character growth and character arcs. I have a couple other points that's just me personally, how I develop characters and how I create fleshed out characters throughout a story just to, make everything feel more three-dimensional. So if you guys are curious, I can just briefly touch on those. One thing that pops up in character development a lot is giving characters flaws and disabilities. And one problem I see a lot is people conflating the two, because flaws and disabilities are two very distinct things. And it's good to give characters both. But if you're trying to make a flawed character and you're only giving them disabilities, then you're doing it wrong. So just briefly go over that. Disabilities can create an obstacle for the main character, but they themselves are not problems that need to be solved over the course of the story. Meanwhile, flaws are character-related issues that create obstacles for the main character and usually do need to be overcome or addressed. And so flaws are things like your character lie. Meanwhile, disabilities are things like your character is suffering from depression or has glasses. These are things that you don't need to fix about them in order for the character to grow and go through their story. So I'll just copy those in real quick. Just again, try not to conflate flaws and disabilities. It's great if your character has some of both, but if you're trying to make a flawed character, giving them disabilities is not how you do it. In fact, usually when you try to fix disabilities, that's when you create problematic scenarios, because everybody or lots of people live with different types of disabilities throughout their lives. And a disability doesn't have to be a physical one. You don't have to be an amputee in order to have a disability. There are invisible disabilities. There are disabilities just based on classism and racism. And again, you don't need to fix this about the character in order for the character to grow. And in fact, trying to fix disabilities with a character is usually creating problematic scenarios. Yes, flaws are tied to the personality. They are usually a choice, a belief, something that is internal to the character that they can choose to change about themselves. And these are usually things that they do change about themselves over the course of a character arc. Although, of course, you don't need to solve all character flaws. You don't need to make them perfect by the end of the book. You usually choose one or two flaws to address over the course of a character arc. Oh my gosh, any tips on how to handle trauma? Personally, no. I cannot speak from experience there, so I do not feel that I am a good resource to give any advice on how to handle trauma in writing. I would seek out people who can be sensitivity readers for you especially if you have not undergone trauma yourself. This is something that you'd want to handle very carefully and thoughtfully and with the advice of people who have personally experienced it. And Coda says that would be a good panel, and absolutely it would be. I would love for that panel to happen at some point. We got to make note of that for WriteHive next spring. Lastly, my personal preference for when I make characters, this is independent from the previous points that have been brought up. I call it my rule of two. And so as a personal rule to flesh out characters and just make them seem more human, in addition to the glow town that we've already talked about, I just jot down 2 separate facts about my characters. And these 2 facts have to be totally unrelated from each other. So for instance, in my current middle grade book, I have a side character who's into makeup. And if that were the character's entire personality, that could be kind of a bit of a cardboard cutout. She'd be a little bit flat. And it also just kind of limits the types of character interactions and conversations that I might have with her. But if I tell you that she's into makeup and she also practices jujitsu, then she starts to feel a little bit more like a fleshed out character, and she's more multidimensional. And it's just a personal principle of mine. If I have a character, I want to have 2 separate unrelated facts about them that just makes them seem more real. So if you have a character that's a jock, are they just a jock, or are they jock and they're also a tea connoisseur? Or if you have a housekeeper, are they just a housekeeper, or do they also have 4 cats that are named after the Beatles? So just, give flavor to your characters. Don't have them just be stereotypes. Don't have them be one-dimensional. Try to, bring multifaceted aspects to their characters. So that's how I write characters personally. I write down their glow town. I write down the lists of their disabilities and flaws, and then I have my rule of 2, just 2 facts about the characters. And of course, if you have more than 2, that's even better. But at least 2 facts about the characters, and I even do this for my side characters, so that they seem more fleshed out and 3-dimensional and real, believable people. And that's pretty much the content of my talk today, guys. I know I kind of blew through a lot of that pretty fast, but you can find all of this on Weiland's blog, which is here, if you guys want to check it out. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this so all of you guys can find this at a later date. And yeah, do we have any more questions? Let's see, I see Wagerman just said, I sometimes seem to create characters with passive wants, such as to be left alone or for nothing to change. I think that's okay. Bilbo once was to be left alone and to eat seed cake, but it feels a little weak. Any thoughts? I think as long as that want and that lie is in conflict with the story that they are in, then it's totally fine. If they are to be a passive character that they just want to be left alone, but then they're thrown into a group and pushed on an adventure, and throughout the adventure they're still kind of resisting it and they're kind of grumpy about it, that can actually be kind of funny if you want to play it a humorous way. And again, we do see Bilbo change across the course of the book. We see him, he went from someone who just wanted to be left alone to someone who is the thief of the group, and they're a big adventure. And then once he goes back home, he finds that he's not really satisfied with quiet life anymore. So I think that you totally can have more passive wants, as long as, again, it is in conflict with the story itself. Yes, and so SK says, I think it can also help to press on a character's wound so that they are actively trying to achieve that passive want because they are threatened with this loss. And the term that uses their wound is basically the same thing as ghost that I've been using throughout this talk. So it's the thing that informs their lie and informs their want that is causing them to, kind of push back against the story that they've been thrown into. So even if it's a passive want, it's causing them to actively try to resist. As long as it's kind of, causing your character to do something. Is the figure of a mentor necessary to help the character evolve positively? Oh, no. You can totally have characters grow without mentorship. And while mentorship is a good way to do it, it's definitely not the end all be all. just going back to some of my examples earlier, we had Woody in Toy Story. He did not have a mentor. It was just him coming to the conclusion over the course of the story that he was wrong and that he, needed to share the spotlight and share empathy, basically. And in our other example, Thor didn't have a mentor within the story either. He was just kind of interacting with people and growing and learning based on the experience that he was put into in the course of the story conflicting with the experiences that he had previously lived throughout the rest of his life. So you don't have to have a mentor, just the course of the story itself and the people they interact with in the setting that they're in can cause that growth to happen within the character. Can a character learn more than one important lesson in one book, or is that too much? For example, my current protagonist thinks the ends justify the means and has to learn otherwise, but behaviorally, she attempts to act more grown up than she ought and also needs to learn that it's okay to let others help and to be a kid sometimes, is trying to do too much. I think you can have this happen, but there's probably going to be at least one of these that's taking front seat to the other ones. Usually what happens by tying your plot arc and your character arc together, the character needs to embrace their want over their need over their want at the climax of the book, and that is what helps them get through the climax. If they were to continue to embrace their want, then they wouldn't be able to progress and the story wouldn't be able to resolve. So the need itself needs to be something that they embrace at the end, which is what allows them to solve the external conflict. And so probably, I'm guessing, all of these different character arcs that you mentioned are not necessarily going to be needed in order to solve the external conflict at the moment of the climax in the end. It's probably just going to be at least one of these things that they need to learn or embrace that's going to lead them to overcoming their internal issues and solving the external problems in the book. So you can definitely have multiple ones, but probably one of those is going to be more relevant to the external story than others. And then you replied, I'm looking at it as the external need is to learn that the end doesn't justify the means in resolving the plot. The internal need is to stop trying to be a grown-up before her time. So I think both of these are kind of internal needs that the character needs to understand. And I'm thinking more of the external plot being like there's some pinch point that they get into where something external to them is happening that this internal realization helps them resolve, if that makes sense. And then we have Thea ask, I will post mine again. Can the want only show up at the end of Act 1? Because in my next book, which is urban fantasy, the main character just kind of figures out what's going on in the first act and doesn't have any specific wants before that. Or will that make her very passive? No, that's fine. Usually the turning point between Act 1 and Act 2 or the inciting incident is where the want pops up a lot of times. Sometimes this want is there before the story begins, and sometimes this want comes as a result of the inciting incident itself. So that's okay if your want isn't immediately apparent, as long as throughout the course of Act 1 there are still conflicts and there is still hints at the character's lie that's present, so that we don't just have kind of a flat story that's going on. We still need movement throughout Act 1. But the want doesn't have to be on page 1, but it should be definitely, absolutely within Act 1. Can you give some examples of characters that are not well fleshed out but do play a main role? Or characters that are almost there but just lacking to be awesome? Oh man, I'm going to have to think about that. Characters that are not well fleshed out but do play a main role. I don't know. If you guys can think of any off the top of your head, go ahead and throw them out there. I'm going to have to think about this for a few minutes because, of course, the characters I think of are all of my favorite characters, which are usually ones that are very fleshed out. So I actually have to think about the ones that are kind of more forgettable, I guess. Yeah, Wagerman says epic characters are less fleshed out, such as James Bond, Conan. They have no arc. That's true. Again, this talk specifically is just about positive character arcs. There are plenty of stories with negative character arcs and even flat character arcs. And that does happen a lot in serialized pieces because clearly you can't have a character go through a character arc resolving one of their flaws every single book if you've got 25 books, because then by the end there's going to be nothing wrong about this character. So yeah, you can absolutely have characters that don't experience character growth but are still fun to follow just by the adventures that they go on. But that's a little bit, I guess, off topic from the current conversation. So this is specifically just about positive character growth. Can you explain a flat arc? I mean, that's pretty much just characters like James Bond that people were mentioning, characters that don't really go through a character growth. Pretty much who they are at the beginning of the story is the same as who they are at the end of the story. One example of that from Avatar, since we're talking about that earlier, Toph. Toph technically is a flat character arc. Who she is at the beginning of the story is pretty much who she is at the end of the story. She hasn't undergone any real change or self reflection. She's pretty much the same character, and I would say a lot of more of the character arc happens around her. But she is still a very compelling and fun character that is one of the fan favorites. And Thea says Iroh too. Yes, Iroh is also a character that, at least in the course of the main series, does not experience any growth. His growth happened before the series itself started. So who he is in the last episode is the same person as who he is in the first episode, pretty much. And yet they're fan favorites. So you can absolutely write flat characters that are beloved by your audience. Yeah, Jenna says that Toph also learns the importance of being part of a group. So that's a good one. That is a very small arc that she goes through over the course of the series. She goes from being independent to being able to rely more on her teammates. I don't know if that's it is a small character arc, but it's not anything like Zuko's character arc, which was pretty dramatic. Okay, well, unless there's any more questions, I'm just going to leave it at that, guys, and we can keep chatting in the text itself. But thank you so much for joining me, and definitely check out KM Weiland's character arcs page. She also has just plot arcs as well, and pretty much anything else you can imagine. So she's got amazing resources on there to help everyone who's looking for more pointers on writing good characters and good plots and just good stories in general. So I wish you all the best. Good luck with your writing out there, and thanks so much for having me today, guys.